They called her the Queen of Comedy, the woman who turned self-deprecation into an art form. With her wild hair, outrageous costumes, and a laugh that could shake the walls, Phyllis Diller became a household name in an era when women were told to stay quiet, polite, and certainly not funny. On stage, she was fearless, firing off jokes about her looks, her cooking, and her infamous imaginary husband, Fang. To the public, she seemed untouchable, a woman who had built a fortress of laughter to protect herself from the world. But behind the bright lights and the perfectly timed punchlines, there was a truth Phyllis never wanted her fans to see. It was a truth so personal, so heavy, that she buried it beneath decades of performance. Every laugh she generated, every quip about her chaotic home life, was part of a grand disguise. She wasn't just telling jokes she was hiding. For decades, the world believed they knew Phyllis Diller. They thought the real woman was the eccentric character on stage, the wild caricature who embraced every imperfection as part of her act. But offstage, she carried a secret that would have changed the way audiences saw her. A secret that challenged the image of the invincible comedienne. As Hollywood cheered her bravery for stepping into a male-dominated field, Phyllis lived with a private struggle that very few knew. It wasn't just insecurity or self-doubt. It was something deeper, something she guarded fiercely, even from close friends. Her comedy was a shield, a carefully crafted illusion to protect herself from questions she wasn't ready to answer. When the spotlight dimmed and the roaring applause faded into silence, Phyllis returned to a private world that looked nothing like the glittering fantasy of her career. She had crafted one of the boldest personas in comedy history, but what lay beneath was not a joke. It was a hidden pain, a vulnerability that she never dared to put into words. The story of Phyllis Diller is not just about the rise of a trailblazer or the laughs that echoed across late-night television. It is about the cost of building a mask so convincing that even those closest to her could not see the truth. For decades, she lived with the fear of exposure, knowing that if her secret ever surfaced, it might unravel the image she had fought so hard to create. Tonight, we peel back the layers of the woman who made America laugh and step into the shadow she left unspoken. The woman who joked about everything but the one thing that mattered most, the hidden truth that Phyllis Diller carried to her grave, and why she believed the world could never know. Phyllis Ada Driver, later known to the world as Phyllis Diller, was born on July 17, 1917, in Lima, Ohio. To the outside observer, there was nothing in her early life that suggested she would one day become a pioneer of comedy, let alone a symbol of liberation for women in entertainment. She was raised in a conservative Midwestern household, one that valued modesty, tradition, and quiet compliance, far more than individuality or self-expression. From her earliest days, Phyllis was aware of an invisible boundary around her, a cultural script that insisted young girls were meant to play roles of dutiful daughters, obedient wives, and silent caretakers. To dream beyond that was not just unconventional, it was dangerous. Her father, Perry Marcus Driver, worked in insurance, and her mother, Frances Ada, kept the home. They were respectable people who wanted respectability for their children. But for Phyllis, the ordinary trappings of that kind of life felt suffocating. She was quick-witted, restless, and secretly mischievous. She discovered early on that humor could be both a weapon and a shield. When she was teased for her appearance, she snapped back with a cutting remark. When the mood in the household grew heavy, she lightened it with an exaggerated story or a silly face. Laughter was her refuge. Yet, even as a child, she sensed that laughter could also hide what she dared not say. By the time she reached high school, Phyllis had cultivated a sharp intelligence and an artistic spirit. She loved music and dreamed of becoming a pianist. For a while, it seemed her destiny might lie in the classical arts. She studied piano seriously, even enrolling at the Sherwood Music Conservatory in Chicago. But life had other plans. The world of professional music, especially for women of her era, was brutally competitive and unforgiving. She felt herself being pushed out before she had truly begun. It was a pattern that would repeat itself throughout her early life. Doors closing, opportunities slipping away, the weight of expectations pulling her toward a conventional life she never truly wanted. Phyllis married young, at just 22 years old, to Sherwood Anderson Diller, the man whose surname she would keep even after their separation. They built a family together, raising 5 children in post-war America. To neighbors and friends, she appeared to be the archetype of a devoted housewife, cooking, cleaning, tending to children, and supporting her husband's ambitions. But beneath the polite smiles and suburban routines, she was struggling with the monotony of domestic life, with the crushing financial pressures that came with raising a large family, and with a gnawing sense that her true self was disappearing into the role of wife and mother. It was during these years of quiet desperation that Phyllis began to refine her greatest survival skill, turning pain into humor. When her cooking failed, she laughed at herself. When her looks didn't match the glossy images of magazine women, she exaggerated her flaws until they became her signature. The beginnings of her comedic persona were born not on stage, but in the kitchen, in the living room, in the private battles of everyday life. She was transforming her struggles into a character that could endure. But there was another battle, one she did not put into words. Behind the curtain of her laughter, Phyllis carried a profound insecurity about her place in the world, not just as a woman, but as an individual. She never fit the mold that her family, her community, and society demanded. She was too bold, too loud, too restless. The very qualities that would later make her a star were the same ones that marked her as a misfit in her youth. And misfits, especially women, were not celebrated in the 1940s and 50s. They were silenced. Phyllis's early years were marked by sacrifices invisible to her audiences. To keep her family afloat, she worked countless odd jobs. She wrote for a newspaper, worked as a copywriter for an advertising agency, even took on freelance assignments that had nothing to do with her passions. She learned discipline, but she also learned exhaustion. She felt trapped in a cycle of survival, unable to imagine a future where she could live authentically. Yet, in these crucibles of hardship, the seeds of her genius were taking root. She began to notice the absurdity in everything. The pressure to be the perfect wife, the impossible beauty standards, the financial struggles that no one wanted to admit. Comedy became her weapon against despair, a way to twist the knife of truth into laughter so sharp that no one noticed the pain behind it. By the early 1950s, her marriage was unraveling. The weight of raising 5 children and managing a collapsing home life became unbearable. But even then, Phyllis disguised her heartache behind jokes. She invented Fang, the fictional husband she ridiculed mercilessly in her routines. To audiences, Fang was a hilarious archetype of the lazy, inept spouse. But to Phyllis, he was also a mask, a way to laugh at her own disappointments without ever revealing the truth of her personal struggles. Her leap into comedy seemed reckless at first. She was nearly 40 years old when she took to the stage, a teen age when most women of her generation were resigned to fading into the background. But Phyllis was different. She had endured too much to stay silent. She started small, performing at San Francisco's famed Purple Onion Club. Her material was raw, honest, and unlike anything audiences had seen. She joked about being a terrible cook, about looking like a housewife gone wrong, about her children, about aging. And she did it all with a fearless energy that electrified the room. Yet, even as she gained momentum, her private self remained carefully guarded. The woman who laughed so loudly in public went home to silence, to doubts, to the same burdens she mocked on stage. She crafted an image that seemed bulletproof, but the cracks were there for anyone who cared to look closely. She had built a persona so exaggerated that it distracted from the truth. The real Phyllis Diller was vulnerable, uncertain, and carrying a secret she believed the world could never accept. Her early life was not just the backdrop of her career, it was the furnace that forged her. Every hardship, every disappointment, every sacrifice became fuel for the fire she would unleash on stage. But it also deepened the chasm between the public Phyllis and the private one. The girl who once dreamed of playing piano on the grandest stages of the world had instead learned to play a different instrument, the laughter of strangers. And in that music, she found both her salvation and her disguise. By the Team A, the world began to know her name. Phyllis Diller had already lived several lifetimes of struggle. To her fans, she was the unstoppable force who shattered barriers in comedy. But to those who looked beyond the stage lights, she was a woman who had built her power on top of fragility. A woman who laughed so others would never hear her cry. And that secret, buried deep within her, was only just beginning to reveal itself. By the mid-1950s, America was in the midst of a cultural shift. Television was rapidly replacing radio as the centerpiece of the home. The nightclub scene was booming, and comedy was dominated by men in suits, telling stories about the office or the golf course. Into this world stepped a woman nearly 40 years old, with 5 children at home, a collapsing marriage, and absolutely no blueprint to follow. Phyllis Diller was not supposed to succeed, but her refusal to accept "supposed to" would become the essence of her story. Her entry into stand-up comedy came almost by accident. Encouraged by friends who had witnessed her razor-sharp wit at parties, she auditioned for San Francisco's Purple Onion, a popular nightclub that had given stage Team A to countless aspiring performers. The management was skeptical. A middle-aged housewife with no professional experience hardly looked like the future of comedy. But the moment she walked on stage, something electric happened. She leaned into every insecurity that had haunted her, her looks, her cooking, her chaotic household, and turned them into punchlines. The audience roared. Not because they pitied her, but because they recognized themselves in her stories. Phyllis did not perform as a glamorous star or a polished entertainer. She performed as an exaggerated version of herself. Wild hair teased high, outrageous costumes, a cackling laugh that pierced the smoky club air. This was not the polite comedy of the era. This was raw, confessional, and subversive. She made herself the butt of every joke, dismantling the myth of the perfect American housewife with each punchline. Women who had silently carried the burdens of domestic life saw themselves reflected in her chaos. Men who thought their wives were alone in their frustrations suddenly realized they were not. Within months, she had gone from unknown to sensation. She extended her run at the Purple Onion for months, eventually performing over 87 consecutive weeks, drawing packed houses night after night. Hollywood began to take notice. Soon, she was appearing on television, first in small guest spots, then in national variety shows. When she performed on The Tonight Show and shared the stage with legendary hosts like Jack Paar and Johnny Carson, her future was sealed. America had never seen anything like her. Yet Phyllis's rise was not just about making people laugh. It was about dismantling barriers. She was one of the first women to perform stand-up comedy on a national stage, and she did so unapologetically. At a Team A, when women were expected to be the joke's subject, she took control and made herself the joke's author. She weaponized insecurity, exposing the absurdity of societal expectations by mocking them before they could mock her. Her act was revolutionary, though she often downplayed its significance. To her, it was simply survival. To the world, it was liberation. Behind the scenes, however, the hidden truth of Phyllis Diller's life grew heavier. The persona she built was so convincing, so larger than life, that people assumed it was real. They thought she truly saw herself as hideous, incompetent, and unworthy. They laughed at Fang, never realizing he was a shadowy stand-in for her own failed marriage. They believed her quips about motherhood, never suspecting how deeply she had struggled with the demands of raising 5 children while trying to forge a career in a ruthless industry. Every laugh she generated also deepened the wall between her public image and her private self. Her career breakthrough came at a steep personal cost. Fame required relentless energy. She toured constantly, traveling from smoky clubs to glittering television studios, often leaving her children behind. The guilt gnawed at her, but she turned it into material, making jokes about being a terrible mother. Audiences howled, but she knew the laughter masked a real ache. For every standing ovation, there was a lonely hotel room waiting at the end of the night. For every successful television spot, there was the fear that her children were growing up without her. Still, Phyllis was unstoppable. By the 1960s, she had become a household name. She starred in her own television specials, appeared in films alongside Bob Hope, and was a frequent guest on talk shows. Her laugh, that unforgettable high-pitched cackle, became her trademark. She was no longer just a comedian, she was an icon. She carved a space in entertainment history where none had existed before, paving the way for women like Joan Rivers, Ellen DeGeneres, and countless others. But the brighter her star burned, the more carefully she guarded her secret. She understood the fragility of her position in Hollywood. Comedy was an industry of illusion, and the illusion she created was her lifeline. She believed that if the world knew the truth, the real source of her insecurities, the depths of her struggles, it might unravel everything she had built. So she doubled down, turning her stage character into armor. She exaggerated her flaws, creating an outrageous caricature so extreme that no one ever looked past it. Critics sometimes dismissed her act as gimmickry, failing to see the brilliance beneath the surface. But Phyllis knew exactly what she was doing. She was holding up a mirror to America's impossible standards for women and laughing at them until the audience joined her. What few understood was that she was also laughing at herself, not out of joy, but out of necessity. The secret she carried was too personal, too painful to reveal, and so she kept burying it beneath layers of wigs, costumes, and laughter. Her breakthrough years were a paradox. The time when she felt most powerful and most vulnerable. She was a pioneer, yet she still wrestled with private doubts. She had an adoring public, yet she often felt isolated. She had financial success, yet she worried constantly about providing for her children. The comedy empire she was building was real, but it was built on top of a foundation of fear. As Phyllis Diller stood beneath the hot stage lights, commanding crowds with her every word, she knew she was doing more than telling jokes. She was creating a mask, a dazzling disguise that hid the truth even from those who thought they knew her best. And as the laughs grew louder, the secret grew darker, waiting for the day when the facade might finally crack. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, Phyllis Diller had risen from obscurity to become one of the most recognizable comedic forces in the United States. She was no longer just the woman who had broken into stand-up comedy at nearly 40 years old. She was a national icon. She appeared on every major talk show, toured across the country, and filled theaters with her manic energy and razor-sharp timing. Her stage persona, the eccentric housewife, with frizzed-out hair, wild gowns, and that unmistakable laugh, was so ingrained in American pop culture that people often forgot there was a real woman beneath the wigs and one-liners. Hollywood embraced her fully. Bob Hope, already a towering figure in comedy, invited her to appear in over a dozen of his films and television specials. Their chemistry was undeniable. His smooth delivery, paired with her chaotic, rapid-fire humor, created a contrast that audiences adored. Diller was no longer just the oddity of a woman doing stand-up in a man's world. She was the star people tuned in to see. She became a staple on programs like The Ed Sullivan Show, The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, and Hollywood Squares. Wherever there was laughter, there was Phyllis Diller. At the same time, her career expanded into music and voice acting. Her training in piano had never completely left her, and she even performed as a soloist with symphonies, showing a depth of talent that most audiences never expected. Later, as animation grew into a mainstream art form, her distinctive laugh and comic timing made her a natural fit for voice roles. Children who had never seen her stand up would recognize her instantly when she lent her voice to characters in cartoons. But the true brilliance of Phyllis Diller at her peak was not just her versatility, it was her endurance. In an industry obsessed with youth, especially for women, Diller managed to reinvent herself again and again. She leaned into aging rather than resisting it, joking about her wrinkles, her aches, her endless beauty treatments. She turned cosmetic surgery into material long before Hollywood was ready to laugh at its obsession with youth. By making herself the subject of the joke, she disarmed critics and audiences alike. What others hid in shame, she paraded with pride. Yet behind the roar of applause, the private Phyllis remained haunted by the secret she could not share. The caricature she had built became more elaborate with each year. The bigger her wigs, the louder her costumes, the wilder her laugh, the deeper she buried her truth. People assumed she was bulletproof, a woman immune to criticism, insecurities, or pain. But the truth was the opposite. Her public confidence was built upon private fragility. Every TMA, she exaggerated her flaws on stage. She was covering the raw wound of how deeply she believed them in private. At the height of her fame, she was also carrying an exhausting schedule. Constant travel, endless performances, and the pressure to remain relevant in a rapidly changing entertainment landscape left her drained. She joked on stage about her cooking, her mothering, her looks, and her love life. But the cost of maintaining this image grew heavier each year. The woman who made America laugh, some at times cried alone after the curtain fell. Her children, now older, sometimes resented the endless absences. They loved their mother, but they also knew they were sharing her with the world. Phyllis used humor to deflect from the pain of this fractured family life. She joked about being a bad mother, about neglecting her children, about preferring the spotlight to the kitchen. Audiences laughed because they recognized the satire. But beneath the satire was a reality she would never fully admit, that fame had forced her to choose between her career and her family. And the choice left her with guilt she could never quite escape. As she reached the peak of her career, Phyllis also became a pioneer in another way. She openly discussed undergoing multiple cosmetic surgeries at a TMA when such things were whispered about in shame. She claimed, some times in jest and some times in seriousness, to have had dozens of procedures. She joked that she had more work done than the Golden Gate Bridge. The press and audiences loved the spectacle. But for Phyllis, cosmetic surgery was more than a punchline. It was another mask. It was her way of shaping herself into the image she believed the world wanted, even as she laughed at the absurdity of it. The truth she hid was that no amount of laughter, no number of facelifts, no roaring ovation could quiet the insecurity at her core. The public saw her as a woman utterly comfortable in her skin, but in private, she never stopped feeling that she had to prove herself, that she had to disguise the fragility she carried. This was the secret she would never confess. The act that made her famous was not just comedy, but camouflage. Still, at the peak of her fame, there were moments when she broke through the disguise. Interviews occasionally revealed a softer, more introspective side. When asked about her beginnings, she admitted the loneliness of her early housewife years. When pressed about her children, she would smile, but rarely go into detail, as though protecting them and herself from exposure. She gave the world everything except her deepest truth. Her dominance in comedy during this era cannot be overstated. She opened doors for women in stand-up that had previously been locked shut. She proved that comedy could be honest, raw, and personal, Long before confessional comedy became the norm, she was not simply a performer. She was a pioneer, cutting a path through a wilderness of prejudice and doubt. But with every trailblazing step, she paid a price. The louder the laughter, the more deafening the silence at home. The brighter the stage lights, the darker the shadows they cast. Phyllis Diller had reached the pinnacle of her career, adored by millions, and yet she was still a woman hiding in plain sight, protecting a truth she believed would change everything if it were ever revealed. Her peak years were glittering, triumphant, and groundbreaking. They were also lonely, exhausting, and fragile. She had built a kingdom of laughter, but within its walls lived a queen who still feared being seen for who she really was. And as the years rolled on, that secret remained buried, even as the legend of Phyllis Diller grew larger than life. Every legend has its shadow. For Phyllis Diller, the shadow was not scandal in the tabloid sense. There were no drug-fueled meltdowns or violent outbursts splashed across headlines. Her darkness was quieter, more insidious, and infinitely more human. It was the constant fear of not being enough, the gnawing loneliness of a woman who had dedicated her life to making others laugh, and the secret she carried beneath the wigs and punchlines. By the 1970s, she was a household name, but fame did not insulate her from pain. Her first marriage had long since collapsed, leaving her to raise 5 children largely on her own. The financial strain of supporting such a large family, combined with the relentless pace of her career, often left her drained. She joked endlessly about money troubles on stage, but in private, those jokes were not far from reality. Stand-up comedy in its early years was not the lucrative empire it would later become. For years, she worked not just to thrive, but simply to survive. Her relationship with her children was complicated. They grew up in the shadow of a famous mother who was rarely home, and although they loved her, the strain of absence was undeniable. Some later admitted to feelings of abandonment. Diller, for her part, transformed her guilt into comedy. She famously quipped that she had so many children because she didn't want her husband to come near her. Audiences laughed, but the truth was more painful. She feared she had traded her family's closeness for applause. And then there was her body. From the very beginning of her career, she used her appearance as a punchline. She mocked her looks, her hair, her clothes, her cooking. She turned herself into the ugly duckling of comedy, exaggerating flaws until they became iconic. But what fans didn't know was how deeply she internalized those flaws. She became addicted to cosmetic surgery long before it was openly discussed. By her own count, she underwent more than 15 procedures, some minor, some major. She turned the scalpel into a punchline. I've had more facelifts than the Golden Gate Bridge, but each operation was also a silent scream that she was never enough as she was. Privately, Diller wrestled with anxiety and bouts of depression. She never allowed herself to show it publicly, fearing that vulnerability would weaken her hard-won status in a male-dominated field. Instead, she pushed herself harder, performing even when she was exhausted, smiling even when she wanted to cry. She once admitted in an interview that the stage was both her salvation and her prison. Salvation because laughter gave her purpose, prison because she could never step out of character without fearing the consequences. Financial pressures also haunted her. Raising 5 children on a comedian's salary required constant hustling. Even as she achieved mainstream success, she often worried about losing it all. The entertainment industry was fickle, especially for women. One wrong move, one cold reception, and she could be replaced by the next rising star. This fear kept her performing long past the point of comfort, long past the point when she should have been resting. Her second marriage, to actor Ward Donovan, ended in divorce after only a few years, compounding her sense of personal failure. For a woman who built her act around mocking her husband, Fang, the collapse of her real marriages carried a sting she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge. Again, she hid behind comedy, crafting jokes that disguised the pain of loss. But perhaps the darkest part of Phyllis Diller's story was the secret she carried about her own sense of worth. She was terrified that if people saw the real her, without wigs, costumes, or punchlines, they would discover that she was ordinary, perhaps even unlovable. This fear drove her obsession with image, both comedic and physical. She needed the mask not only for her audience, but for herself. Without it, she feared she would crumble. Critics occasionally targeted her for being too much, too loud, too flamboyant, too desperate. These criticisms cut deeper than she let on. She had worked tirelessly to carve out a space in a world that did not welcome her, and still she faced dismissals from those who thought her act was a gimmick. She laughed it off in public, but in private, the barbs left scars. The comedy industry itself was not kind to women. Diller endured sexism at every level, from being dismissed by male peers to being underpaid compared to her counterparts. She knew that every joke she delivered was not only entertainment, but also a battle cry. Proof that women could be just as sharp, just as bold, just as unflinchingly funny as men. Yet, carrying the banner of trailblazer came with isolation. Few women of her generation shared her path, and she often felt like she was fighting alone. Her health also began to suffer under the strain. The grueling tours, late-night performances, and relentless demand to stay relevant wore on her body. She masked fatigue with makeup, wigs, and high-energy delivery. But backstage, she was often exhausted to the point of collapse. She rarely admitted this publicly, for fear that any sign of weakness would unravel her carefully crafted persona. And yet, through it all, she never allowed the mask to slip. Her fans saw only the outrageous queen of comedy, the woman who could turn any flaw into a laugh line. They did not see the quiet nights of loneliness, the moments of regret, or the insecurities that drove her under the surgeon's knife time and time again. They did not see the toll fame had taken on her children or the private doubts that haunted her every success. Phyllis Diller's darkness was not scandalous, it was human. It was the cost of a life lived under the spotlight, the price of turning oneself into a perpetual joke so that others could find joy. Her secret was not one sensational revelation, but a lifetime of disguising vulnerability with laughter. She carried it through every performance, every interview, every standing ovation. And though the world adored the character she created, very few ever glimpsed the fragile woman who lived beneath it. By the 1980s and 1990s, the whirlwind of Phyllis Diller's career began to slow. She was still performing, still appearing on television, still making people laugh with her outrageous costumes and her thunderous laugh. But Time was catching up with her. The woman who once seemed tireless now faced the reality of aging in an industry that worshipped youth. Yet, rather than retreat in bitterness, Phyllis embraced her later years with the same irreverent humor that had defined her life. She made jokes about her wrinkles, about being a senior citizen, about her endless cosmetic surgeries. She turned the inevitability of age into material, disarming audiences with honesty, even as she kept her most profound truths locked away. Her later career saw her transition from the demanding grind of stand-up tours to television appearances, guest spots, and voice work. Younger generations, who had never seen her live at the Purple Onion or trading barbs with Johnny Carson, came to know her through animated characters. That unmistakable laugh, once a weapon against a hostile world, now reached new audiences in children's shows and films. Phyllis had managed to reinvent herself once again, ensuring her relevance even as the comedy landscape evolved around her. But privately, life was quieter. She had more time to reflect, to think about the decades she had spent building and maintaining a persona. Friends who visited her in her sprawling Los Angeles home often noted how different she was away from the cameras. The wigs came off, the costumes were put away, and what remained was a woman who was softer, quieter, and far more introspective than her stage image suggested. She was not always on, not always ready with a punchline. In these private moments, the hidden Phyllis revealed herself a woman who had spent a lifetime deflecting pain with humor and who now wondered how history would remember her. Financially, she was finally stable, though it had taken decades of relentless work to achieve that security. She had invested carefully, owned property, and continued to work in media projects well into her 70s. Unlike many entertainers who flamed out or lost their fortunes, Diller managed to sustain herself, but the drive to perform never completely left her. Even into her 80s, she made occasional public appearances, delivering short sets or appearing on television specials. Each TMA, she was greeted with roaring applause, proof that the world had not forgotten her. In interviews during these later years, she allowed glimpses into her private world, but always selectively. She spoke about her children, about her marriages, about the struggles of her early years. Yet, the deepest truth, the one that fueled her insecurities and her relentless pursuit of reinvention, remained unspoken. She gave just enough honesty to satisfy curiosity, but she never exposed the full vulnerability she carried. The mask had become second nature, and even in her 80s, she was not ready to remove it. Her home itself became a reflection of her life. It was filled with bright colors, eccentric decorations, and, of course, the tools of her trade: wigs, costumes, props. Visitors described it as part museum, part sanctuary. It was a space where the line between Phyllis Diller, the performer, and Phyllis Diller, the woman, blurred. The house was both a shrine to her public persona and a refuge for her private self. As the years passed, health issues became more pressing. She suffered from arthritis, heart problems, and the general frailty that comes with old age. Yet, even in hospital rooms, she found ways to make people laugh. Nurses and doctors would recall how she cracked jokes during treatments, refusing to let illness steal her gift. For Phyllis, humor remained not only her profession, but her armor. She needed it as much as her audience did. By the early 2000s, Phyllis Diller was recognized not just as a comedian, but as a trailblazer. Younger female comics, from Joan Rivers to Ellen DeGeneres, openly acknowledged the doors she had opened. Comedy festivals honored her, retrospectives celebrated her groundbreaking career, and documentaries began to explore her influence. She was no longer merely the punchline. She was the foundation upon which others had built their success. And yet, even as she basked in the respect of a new generation, she continued to downplay her significance. In typical Diller fashion, she deflected praise with humor. She claimed she had only ever been trying to make a living, that her trailblazing was accidental. But those who knew her well understood the truth. She had been deliberate, calculated, and brave. She had fought for her place in comedy, even when the industry tried to push her out. Her later years were also marked by a quieter kind of fulfillment. She painted, she wrote, and she spent time with her grandchildren. She found joy in the simple things, even as her health declined. She no longer needed the roar of a nightclub audience every night. Smaller joys sustained her, yet she never fully abandoned the mask. To the very end, she carried her secret, believing that the world would never fully accept the vulnerable woman behind the laughter. On August 20th, 2012, Phyllis Diller passed away peacefully at her Los Angeles home at the age of 95. Obituaries across the world celebrated her as a comedy legend, a trailblazer, and a fearless icon. Colleagues and fans alike mourned her, remembering the way she had made them laugh in times when laughter was most needed. But very few spoke of the fragility, the insecurities, and the hidden truth she had carried for decades. In death, as in life, Phyllis remained a woman defined by the mask she had so carefully built. Her legacy, however, is undeniable. She shattered barriers for women in comedy, turned self-deprecation into an art form, and proved that laughter could be both weapon and shield. She was a pioneer, not because she sought to be, but because she refused to be silenced. The generations of female comedians who followed her stand on the shoulders of the woman who once walked nervously onto the stage of The Purple Onion and dared to be funny. In the end, Phyllis Diller's story is not only about the jokes, the wigs, or the laughter. It is about resilience. It is about a woman who took her pain and transformed it into joy for millions. It is about the cost of hiding one's deepest self behind a mask and the power of leaving behind a legacy so enduring that even the secret remained secondary to the laughter. When Phyllis Diller passed away in 2012, the tributes poured in. Comedians young and old hailed her as the woman who cracked open the doors of stand-up comedy for every female performer who followed. The obituaries painted her as the Queen of Comedy, the fearless pioneer who turned self-deprecation into a crown and wielded laughter like a weapon. And all of it was true. Yet, for those who looked a little deeper, there remained a haunting question. Who was Phyllis Diller when the wigs were off? When the makeup was removed? When the stage lights went dark? Her legacy is undeniable. She redefined comedy at a TMA when women were not welcome on the stage. Before Diller, the very idea of a woman standing in front of a microphone, commanding an audience with jokes about her marriage, her looks, her failures, was almost unthinkable. She took the stereotypes that oppressed her homeliness, incompetence in the kitchen, nagging wifehood, and turned them into ammunition. In doing so, she didn't just make audiences laugh. She made them question the absurdity of those stereotypes themselves. Comedy historians credit her with inventing a new form of persona-driven humor. She wasn't telling jokes in the abstract. She was embodying them. Her outrageous clothing, her laugh, her imaginary husband, Fang, they were all parts of a carefully constructed character that blurred the line between performance and reality. And this is where her hidden secret becomes most fascinating. The possibility that Phyllis Diller spent her entire life living between the woman she was and the woman she performed. Friends often described her as shy in private, almost reserved, a stark contrast to the hurricane of chaos she unleashed on stage. Some wondered if the caricature she created had consumed the real woman, if perhaps she no longer knew where the mask ended and she began. Was the real Phyllis simply too vulnerable to reveal, or had she become so fused with her stage persona that she ceased to exist outside of it? The question of her secret is not about a single scandalous revelation, but about the very nature of her disguise. For decades, she hid behind her act, her exaggerated ugliness, her endless self-mockery, her insistence that she was never quite good enough. Was this all just comedy? Or was it a confession disguised as humor? Did she truly believe the flaws she presented? Or were they simply tools to keep the world from asking deeper questions about her pain, her loneliness, her longing? One theory, often whispered among those who studied her career, is that Phyllis Diller's greatest secret was the depth of her insecurity. She wanted desperately to be taken seriously as a pianist, as an artist, as a mother. But when those avenues closed, she built an empire on mocking herself. In this sense, her legacy is bittersweet. She empowered generations of women by proving they could be funny. Yet she herself may never have fully believed she was enough without the jokes. Another unanswered question revolves around her family life. She often joked about being a terrible mother, but behind the humor was real guilt and real tension. Her children both admired and struggled with her fame. Was her comedy an attempt to make light of her absences, or was it an unconscious confession of the price they paid for her success? That tension remains unresolved, a shadow hanging over the laughter. And then there is the question of her obsession with cosmetic surgery. While she joked about it constantly, the truth was more complex. Was it pure vanity? A desire to reinvent herself endlessly? Or was it the most visible expression of her secret vulnerability, her belief that without alteration, she was unworthy of attention or love? By laughing about her surgeries, she diffused criticism, but she never fully explained the deep compulsion behind them. Despite these lingering mysteries, the eye impact of Phyllis Diller's life is undeniable. She gave women permission to speak, to be loud, to own the stage in a way that had previously been forbidden. She showed that imperfection could be powerful, that flaws could be transformed into art. Every female comedian who has stood behind a microphone since owes her a debt, whether they know it or not. Her legacy also extends beyond comedy. She became a cultural symbol of resilience, a reminder that it is never too late to reinvent oneself. She didn't begin her career until she was nearly 40, an age when most women of her generation were expected to fade quietly into domestic obscurity. Instead, she launched a revolution, proving that talent, drive, and authenticity could defy any imitable. Yet the final irony of her story is this: the very secret she kept, her fragility, her insecurity, her private pain, is part of what made her so revolutionary. By refusing to reveal it outright, she turned it into performance. She gave the world the laughter it craved, while guarding her deepest truth for herself. In a way, her silence about her inner struggles was its own act of courage. She chose to define herself not by confession, but by creation. Today, when people look back at Phyllis Diller, they see the outrageous clothes, the wigs, the cackling laugh. They see the woman who made Johnny Carson double over on live television, the woman who traded barbs with Bob Hope, the woman who reigned supreme in nightclubs and on talk shows. But for those who listen more closely, there is also a quiet echo, the sound of what she never said, the secret she carried, the vulnerability she refused to expose. Perhaps that is the final gift she left us, the reminder that every public figure carries a private self. Every laugh hides a shadow. Every performance is a kind of mask. Phyllis Diller's legacy is not just about comedy. It is about humanity. It is about the complex, messy truth of living in a world that demands perfection while punishing those who show it. In the end, the question remains, what was the secret Phyllis Diller kept hidden for decades? Was it insecurity? Loneliness? The pain of sacrifice? Or was the secret simply that she was human, flawed, fragile, and yearning to be loved, just like everyone else? The world may never know for sure, but perhaps the real answer lies not in what she hid, but in what she gave. She gave courage to women who dreamed of standing on stage. She gave us permission to laugh at our own imperfections, and in doing so, she ensured that her legacy would live long after the wigs were packed away and the laughter faded into silence. Phyllis Diller's story, like her comedy, is timeless, outrageous, defiant, heartbreaking, and profoundly human. Her secret may have gone with her to the grave, but the joy she left behind continues to echo across generations. And maybe, just maybe, that was her plan all along.